later in the show. I also want to speak with Chiang Lim. I said I'd do this yesterday. Chiang's the CEO of Australian Childcare Alliance in New South Wales. And there was that story yesterday. And for the life of me, I've done a lot of reading on this, but I just can't get to the bottom of why it is so. But it was reported yesterday in the Nine papers that half of the federal government's recent effort to cut the cost of childcare, and it was successful at the time, in places like Melbourne have brought the cost of childcare down 20%. That is out-of-pocket costs down 20%. But half of it in the intervening 12 to 18 months has already been gobbled up with fee increases. So when you consider that national inflation is running at around about 1.7%. The last 12 months it's been 1.7, 1.9%, something like that. And yet when it comes to childcare, the inflation rate over the same 12 months in Brisbane, for example, has been 9.4%. In Melbourne, 11.2%. Even in Sydney, double the official inflation rate at 3.7%. You do have to start asking the question, why is it so? How come childcare, the cost of childcare is just going up astronomically when the rest of the economy is struggling to inflate? There may be some reasons, and Chiang would be in a pretty good position to probably shine a light on them. I'll speak to him later in the show, but in the meantime, you might have some ideas, particularly if you're a parent or a grandparent. I mean, you might work in the industry. Sure, you give us an idea, but if you're a parent or a grandparent and you're doing the budget, you're doing your numbers, and you think, oh, well, look, there's $2.5 billion from Canberra added in the form of rebates, assistance to low and middle income earners just last year, because the government rightly identified that childcare costs, out-of-pocket costs, were crippling family budgets. Wages are flat, yet childcare prices going through the roof. So the government said, all right, well, here's a whole bunch of money from us. Spend it on childcare. And a lot of people said, thanks very much. At the time, I said it wouldn't work. I've been vindicated. I wasn't the only one, of course. Many people made that point. Because whenever governments, so this is the point, I think, whenever governments give money, be it for childcare rebates, first home buyers grants, whatever it is, whenever there's money available because an industry is fleecing its clients, and the government gives money to clients of that industry to say, well, listen, it's an essential service, and you're finding it tough to make ends meet, and so here's a bit of money to help. I mean, does anyone seriously think the providers of that service are going to say, oh, well, that's very generous of the government. They've provided all this money, so we're just going to pause our fee increases, and we're going to operate as if that money were never available and let families catch up. I mean, what? These are businesses in a capitalist, robust, cutthroat economy. A government writes a cheque for $2.5 billion, all of which is going to go to that sector, and the many businesses that comprise that sector, all the individual childcare centres. They're going to just rub their hands together and say, you beauty, $2.5 billion that we didn't have last week, it's coming our way, but we'll keep hiking the fees anyway. I mean, it's just a ridiculous transfer of money from the taxpayer to the childcare sector. And what has the taxpayer got for it? Well, by the look of this, a most brief catching of the breath when it came to fee help, which has basically already been gobbled up. I mean, in Brisbane, for example, after the government pumped all this money into the low and middle income households with kids at childcare, the price did go down by 9.7%. That is, the out-of-pocket costs did go down by 9.7%. Terrific. But in the 12 months since, they've gone up by 9.4%. So in other words, it's back to status quo. So what's the government going to do? Pump another $2.5 billion into the sector and have the same thing happen all over again? I mean, all that's happening here, surely, is that some, not all, but some childcare providers are getting rich. And parents continue to struggle to afford the service. I just can't, and I'll put this to Chiang, I can't for the life of me understand how it can cost virtually the same to educate an 18-year-old at a top city private school doing their HSC, so they're studying a science and a math subject in English, and they're probably doing sport and art and all these things. How can it cost the same to educate that child at that level as it does to leave a 3-year-old in childcare 5 days a week. It has me completely beaten. I have no idea how, but that's the fact. That's the fact. So, I don't know, you might know more than me. Chances are you probably do with this, but as I said, I'll try to get some answers out of Chiang later in the show. 131873 the number. Well, it was reported yesterday morning that half of the federal government's effort to cut the cost of childcare has already been gobbled up with fee increases, miles and miles above inflation. The ABS's Consumer Price Index showed that childcare costs lifted 2.5% in the 3 months to the end of September, but that was the fourth quarterly increase in prices since the government's so-called reforms last year. Now, you might recall that in July of last year, the Morrison government introduced a $2.5 billion assistance package for families, targeted specifically, and this is fair enough, at low and middle income earners who were really feeling the pinch when it came to childcare costs. And straight after they introduced the package, I suppose initially it did the trick, because childcare costs did go down by 11.8% nationally. In places like Melbourne and Canberra, in fact, the cost went down by almost a fifth, by almost 20%. I mean, success. But straight after, the bills started to rebound. And in fact, the biggest increase has been in Melbourne, where they've now lifted by 11.2% over just the past 12 months. In Brisbane, the cost of childcare gone up 9.4% over the same time period. I mean, let me ask, what else? What else across the economy has gone up 9.4% or 11.2% in the last 12 months? Not even electricity prices have gone up by that. So what is driving this? It's the eternal question. I've always thought childcare was terribly expensive to the point of being well and truly overpriced. But I can't ever get an answer as to why it is so. Thought we'd turn to Chiang Lim. He's the CEO of the Australian Childcare Alliance in New South Wales. He's on the line. Chiang, thanks for your time.
G'day, how are you?
I'm okay, but I'm not paying childcare fees. I reckon there'd be a hell of a lot of mums and dads out there at this time of the morning getting up, getting ready for work, and that means they've got to send their 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 children to childcare, and they're looking at these price increases and thinking, what on earth is going on?
And look, Michael, I happen to be also one of those parents. I've got 3 kids under 4, a 4-year-old and twin boys, 2 and 2. And they do attend daycare as well. And I feel the pain as well, equally, just like all the other parents as well. It is worth starting out by saying that the services that are, well, I can only speak for New South Wales. I can't speak for the other states. But in New South Wales, the predominant number of service providers that provide early childhood education and care are small business owners. And I can tell you with the hand on my heart and a stack of Bibles, we already care deeply for our families, and we work very, very hard to keep the costs down as much as possible by already absorbing most of the increasing costs. Now, you must also understand that there are some structural issues within the system that's effectively trying to push childcare costs up. One thing which is glaring is there is most parents don't know this, but there is a severe labor shortage. And when you have a labor shortage, guess what? Services have, in order to comply with regulation, have to hire whoever is available. And when labor is short, you have to pay a bit of a premium to get the staff that you need. That will help explain, I wouldn't say all of it, but I would say a significant part of the reasons why labor costs have gone up.
I understand that, and that's market economics. But I mean, a bit of a premium is one thing. 9.4%, or in Melbourne's case, 11.2% in 12 months. That's more than a bit of a premium. That's extortion, isn't it?
Sure. Well, look, it is high, and Australia already has, and no thanks to the OECD, Australia already has been declared for the last 2 years as having the most expensive childcare out-of-pocket household proportion of costs in the world, right? And while I feel for Victorian parents, New South Wales bears the most expensive.
It's the most expensive. I remember last time we spoke, that's exactly what you said. Why is it cheaper abroad than it is here? Is it because governments overseas subsidise even more heavily than they do here, or are there other factors?
Well, I'll give you one example, which again might help explain the situation. Now, you will recall in the last 2 years, the CPI only increased by 2.1% last year and 1.9% the year before.
Yes.
But you know what? We have a Fair Work Commission system, and every year the Fair Work Commission says you must increase your minimum annual wage rates by X percent. And in the last 2 years, for early childhood education, it was increased by 3% year on year. Now, that's above the CPI. Then you also have to take into consideration the Commonwealth Child Care Subsidy increased very slightly from $11.77 to $11.98. That's 21-cent increase. That's only 1.8. So when you have 1.8% increase. So when you factor all these issues that where the child care subsidies from the Commonwealth is not increasing or not keeping pace with the Fair Work Commission's mandate of increasing labor costs, then you got on top of that a labor shortage as well, plus a regulatory system that effectively drives a lot of costs in the system already. You've got a bit of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, well, the disaster's brewing a pretty unsavoury meal, it has to be said. Look, of course, the issue that brought this story to light is that the government, about 18 months ago, as you know, the Morrison government, brought in a $2.5 billion payment, basically, of subsidy for low and middle income earners because they identified that childcare for a lot of these people was simply becoming unaffordable. And you and I would agree it was. And the numbers suggest that that rebate helped very much. As I said, in Melbourne, for example, in Canberra, about a fifth of the cost, boom, straight away, government's covering that instead of mums and dads out of their wages. And so, happy days. But how effective really at the end of the day are all of these rebates? I mean, not just in childcare, but that's your expertise, but you look right around the economy, be it a first home buyer's grant or a childcare rebate or all these sort of payments. To me, they are just red rags to a bull for operators, aren't they? Saying, well, look, all this money's sloshing about, keep your fees the way they were, take the money and just keep upping the fees, because all of a sudden the parents have got all this money they didn't have. They've got to spend it on childcare because that's what it's for. It's not just money that you can just go and spend at the shops. And, I mean, the people that are taking it are the operators.
I'm not so sure whether that's the case in every situation. And don't forget, last time we spoke, we also spoke about there's this current phenomenon called childcare oversupply. There is actually in a number of parts of across Australia where there is an oversupply of childcare, and unlike in other markets when there's an oversupply of something, prices go down. In our industry, when the oversupply goes up, prices also go up as well.
Yeah, but why? I mean, this is a free market, childcare. There's a lot of private operators, small businesses.
Sure.
If there's an oversupply of cupcakes in a suburb, you've either got to sell them at a half price or they go off. But if there's an oversupply of childcare, the prices keep going up. How does that work?
Because if the number of customers don't fall fast enough, you can't cut your costs fast enough. There are a number of fixed costs like real estate, like labor, and regulation that requires you to maintain a certain staff to children ratio. If the number of customers drop not fast enough, you're still holding on to significant costs.
You mentioned regulation. Of course, under the Gillard government, a lot of rather stringent regulation was mandated from Canberra, including, as you said, the ratios and the tertiary qualifications for staff and all that. And that all, you're quite right, that all adds to the bottom line cost. And who bears that? Parents or taxpayers, often the same person.
Right.
How much of an issue is regulation in this price issue in Australia as opposed to other markets abroad?
Look, there's been no study. There's been no comprehensive study to compare apples with apples of us in Australia versus other countries. There's been no perfect study to explain whether our regulations are more expensive than other regulations. And don't forget, there's also cultural issues as well. So it is not. You can't compare apples with apples in a sense. However, I think it's fair to say that the Commonwealth has tried to do its bit, and don't forget, the Commonwealth can only do so much.
That's right.
Their biggest levers tends to be in terms of monetary redistribution, and that's exactly what they've done with regards to Child Care Subsidy. And we welcome the KPMG's report saying that the way how the Child Care Subsidy has been structured, it actually has a disincentive, a structural disincentive to the partner that's not working full time, and if that partner who wants to work more, actually there is a disincentive to work more. So there are problems. There are problems that the
because they get. Just to explain, Chiang, that is because that person then gets less of a rebate from Canberra. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct,
Okay. Fine.
Correct.
Yep.
Correct. And perhaps the cap was set too low. And for very expensive states like New South Wales and perhaps Victoria, I don't know how a law can differentiate two states versus the rest of the country. I don't know how that will occur. But the one thing which we haven't done yet is to relook at what else is there and how do we collaboratively work together, Commonwealth, state, local, all the services together. How can we improve the process? And we're not there yet. We're pushing for that, but we're not there yet.
Okay. One last one before you go. Is it in any way understandable that you can send a 16 or 18-year-old child to a top private school studying science and maths and art and sport and all these sort of things for the same price that you can send a 3-year-old 5 days a week to childcare? Because to me that seems ridiculous. But in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, in many suburbs, that's exactly the financial situation.
You're quoting from my report, aren't you? That's exactly what has happened in the last few years, whereby, and it is a welcome relief that the Commonwealth is trying to address that. Thank you, federal government. However, the process, the problem still exists. We need a much more holistic, harmonized approach to solving this problem, and we're not there yet.
Good to talk, Chiang. I thank you for your time, and thank you for being so open about it all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye there. Chiang Lim, CEO of the Australian Childcare Alliance in New South Wales.